Hey, it's Mike. Let's talk about Reaper. It's not uncommon these days for bands to record separately instead of live on the floor as a full band as we used to. When a band is performing all at the same time, sometimes they'll use a click and sometimes they won't. In those instances, the timing usually doesn't matter that much because the band will naturally ebb and flow a little bit in tempo, but they'll still stay together. Take a listen to Back in Black from AC/DC and you'll quickly note that the tempo is not consistent across the entire performance. But with all that said, sometimes you may receive tracks from a performer who did not record to a click. This can be common with singer-songwriter types where someone's just playing an acoustic guitar and singing along. And while that performance may sound good on its own, once again, just like with Back in Black, if you were to measure it with a metronome, you'd quickly see that the tempo fluctuates quite a bit. I was recently sent a track by my friend Bathrobe Dave, and he asked if I could add some drums to the performance. Once I received the track from him, I quickly discovered that he did not record to a click. But the performance did sound good and I wanted to give it a fair shot and see if I could play along to it anyway. As you may be aware, in Reaper you can stretch audio or you can slip edit to make things line up to a grid. But in a case like this, where I preferred the original performance, I wanted to create a custom grid that conformed to the music instead of the other way around. Let's take a look. The song that I was sent was a cover of Happier Than Ever by Billie Eilish. Instead of being sent multi-tracks, I was sent a mixdown of Work in Progress. The song starts off in 4/4 time and then later on goes to 6/8 time. I looked it up online to find the tempo, but nothing that I did would make the metronome work with the performance. I did play along to a part of the song just to see if I could keep time on it, but something that you should consider is if you plan to send your project to someone else to contribute, they need to have some type of a consistency in order to keep time with the music. But no matter how much I might listen to and practice to this track, there's no way that I can accurately predict the push-pull and fluctuation of the tempo. And even if I were to go back and try to slip edit and tighten up my drum performance, again, without having a reliable grid, I really don't have much to work with. Let's take a listen to a bit of this and see if you can detect the fluctuations in the tempo, and then we'll go back and show how to create your own custom tempo map in Reaper. I'll start somewhere around the portion where the song switches to 6/8 time because the preceding part has no drums. I didn't play throughout the entire 6/8 part of the song, I only played over a portion just to see if I could play along to it at all. But again, let's take a listen and see what we've got so far.
You call me again, drunk in your Benz, driving home under the influence. You scare me to death, but I'm wasting my breath, 'cause you only listen to your fucking friend. I don't relate to you, I don't relate to you, no, 'cause I'd never treat me this shitty.
You get the idea. The performance is not bad, but if we were to try to add any time-based effects to this project or virtual instruments, it would be near impossible to get things to line up properly. So let's take a look at tempo mapping in Reaper. I'll start by soloing my backing track since that's the primary thing that I want to focus on, and I'd also like to go ahead and remove my dock so I can focus on the actual track up top here. The tempo map doesn't show by default, so we'll open that up by clicking on View and Tempo Envelope. I also like to turn on my master track for this. The default key press is Alt-T, and with my master track showing as well, if I increase the height on this, I'll be able to see my tempo map a bit better. Now I may inadvertently interchange tempo map and tempo envelope, but I mean the same thing regardless of which word I might use. Before I get too far into this, another thing that I'd like to do is shift all of my content down a little bit to leave a couple of measures at the beginning of the track. While this step is not 100% necessary, I found it pretty useful because of the way that things tend to shift once I start adjusting the grid. So I'll zoom out my project to see the entire thing, select all of my tracks, and shift everything down maybe 2 measures. Another thing that I want to make sure to do is to change the Timebase for my project. If you're not familiar with Timebase in Reaper, that dictates what happens to media items when the time changes. For example, if I were to change my time signature or tempo across the project, If my time base is set incorrectly, the audio will change to match the time. In this case, I want my audio to stay exactly the same as it was recorded, and I simply want to change my grid to match the audio. You can change that on tracks individually, but in this case I'd like to make it a project-wide setting. So I'll click on File and Project Settings, and under the Default Project Settings tab, I'll make sure that Timebase for items, envelopes, and markers is set to time. I believe the default in Reaper is beats, position, length, and rate, but just make sure that you're set to time if you're going to be creating a custom time map like this. The second parameter, Timebase for tempo, time signature envelope, I leave that at beats. And then I'll press OK, and we're set. As I stated earlier, this song starts off in 4/4 time and then switches to 6/8 time. With Reaper set at its default tempo of 120, I believe this will come into play somewhere around measure 62. So I'll zoom in a bit, find measure 62, and test. And that sounds about right, somewhere around measure 62. This is also why I wanted to shift my project forward a couple of measures. That way I can make sure that when I want to get started on this tempo map, I can slip edit or shift my project a little bit further to make sure that everything lands on a beat. In order to change my time signature, I'll need to add a tempo marker here. So I'll click on Insert and Tempo/Time Signature Change Marker. If memory serves, this part of the song should be approximately 73 beats per minute, and I need to change my time signature to 6/8 time. We'll leave our beats per minute basis at quarter notes, and press OK. I'd also like to go back into my metronome and change my beat pattern just to match what I'd prefer to hear. And I'll switch that to be all secondary beats, that way all of my metronome clicks have the same tone. I'll turn that up a bit, enable my metronome, and let's take a quick listen. And we can hear that that's already off a bit. Now in retrospect, it sounds like he may have messed up a little bit on that measure, so perhaps we should move this directly over to 62, or perhaps I made a mistake because it looks like I put my marker on 61 instead of 62. Whichever the case may be, this is fixable, and what we're about to do is actually the basis of how this whole process works. When I added my first time signature and tempo marker, I'm now able to grab this marker and move it to change the grid. So I'll hold Control while clicking the 73 BPM 6/8 time marker and left click and drag to move this to where the measure should actually start. Now it may take a few tries to find it. And you may also notice that I've changed to Spectral Peaks because that helps me to better see where the transients may lie. We'll back this up just a bit further and see if this lines up. And it looks like we may need to move just a little bit further. And we'll try from there. There. That seems to be our proper starting point, and as you can hear, 73 BPM seems to be about right, but there's definitely some fluctuation. Let's begin to edit our tempo envelope to better match. Another thing that I'd like to do before getting too far into this is right-clicking the envelope, go to Envelope Defaults, and Tempo Envelope Range. Changing this setting will allow the tempo envelope to be a little bit more towards the center of this range as opposed to closer to the bottom. The default is 40 to 280 beats per minute, but I don't think it's going to fluctuate quite that far, so I'd like to change my minimum to, let's try 65, and our maximum to, let's try 150, and OK. And that has changed the visualization of my tempo envelope to give me a bit more room to work with. Now with this being in 6/8 time, I want to make sure that my grid is set to eighth notes. You can change your grid setting by right-clicking the grid icon in the toolbar, and under Show Grid Line Spacing, change this to the desired value. Again, I'll be using eighth notes for this exercise. I will admit this process is pretty tedious, so we'll go through a few measures of this and then I'll show you the finished product. What we'll be doing is adding an envelope point to each of these eighth notes and then warping our grid to make sure that the grid falls on the beats in the recorded audio. It'll make more sense as we go. So making sure that snapping is turned on, hold Shift and left click on the envelope to add a point at each of the grid spaces. So I've got my eighth notes for the first measure, and what I'll do next is listen to this measure, and I can shift these points as needed. Let's take a listen. Now that first one sounded pretty good. It could stand a small amount of tightening up. I'll zoom in a bit. Our second beat looks good. Our third beat looks good. Our fourth one is a little bit questionable, and we can shift that by holding Control and clicking on the tempo marker in the top of the grid, and left-clicking and dragging. You'll notice as I drag that the tempo changes between the previous marker and the current marker. We can also see what that tempo is at the top of the grid. So at the beginning of this section, we're at 73 beats per minute, 73 beats per minute again on my second eighth note, then we drop to 70.106 and back to 73. Let's take a listen to this again and see if our next two markers line up okay. My last marker before measure 62 is a little bit late, so I'll hold Control, click the 73 BPM in the grid, and shift it back to the left to match up a bit. And once again, we can see our tempo envelope changing so that our speed constantly changes to match what's actually recorded, so long as we've lined things up properly. Let's take a listen again. And that sounds pretty good. I'll turn up my metronome a bit. I want to make sure that that is audible. And you may not have even heard it yet, so let me double check and make sure that I am playing my metronome through monitor effects, which is what goes out to OBS. If I was wrong about that, I'll edit this part out in post, but if I was right, you now know how the metronome gets over to OBS. So moving down to the next measure, we'll add our points. And go back and listen, and then adjust the grid as necessary. This beat here is definitely late, so I'll hold Control and drag back. Now it's important to understand that anytime that you shift one of these markers, whatever is before it will adjust its timing as well. So I try my best to not have to go back and forth a lot and always be working further downstream. Let's back up a little bit further and take a listen. Right, that measure's sounding pretty good. Let's do a few more just so that you understand the process, and then I'll show you the finished product. Once again, what's happening is for each of these points that I place, it's adding a tempo marker at the top of my grid, and I can hold Control on the tempo marker and left-click and drag to shift that marker. And I'm doing my best to make sure that each of these tempo markers lines up with what I'm hearing as the beat in this recorded project. I mentioned the Spectral Peaks earlier, but I don't think that I actually showed how to achieve that. If Spectral Peaks is something that you would find useful in your projects, click on View, Peaks Display Settings, and change your display mode to Spectral Peaks. With Spectral Peaks, the colors will help you to understand what frequencies are most prominent in that part of the music. In this case, since I was sent a rendered file that contains both guitar and vocals, the Spectral Peaks just helps me to better see where the beats might be. I'll close out of this dialog and let's get back to editing. We've got that measure, so now I need to add more points for the next measure. And just as before, I'll listen and adjust as necessary. Now so far this has been pretty easy to do since all we've heard is guitar and he has a pretty prominent strum for each of the beats. But as we get into the vocals, we'll have to listen a little bit harder and make sure that our points fall on the beat properly. Let's add our points for the next section. and listen and adjust as necessary. I'm not sure what happened in this portion right here. That's baked into the audio and there's not much that I can do about it. We'll add our points to the next measure. Now, if you are using Spectral Peaks to help you better identify where the beats are, but you're still having difficulty seeing the waveforms, you can increase the height of the waveform by holding Shift and pressing up on the keyboard. This will change the height of the waveforms visually, but it will not change the volume. That's a little bit better. Let's keep working. Let's do a few more measures and make sure that we can get to where the vocals start. I thought I was already there, but sometimes I'm wrong. Let's keep working. That looks pretty good. These spectral peaks really help, but let's take a listen and make sure that we're accurate.
You call me.
Okay, we're at the point with the vocals, so let's try to do a few more measures here. I'll add my points to this measure, and again, to add the points, hold Shift and click on the line. So we'll go back and listen to this section, and we'll adjust the grid as necessary by holding Control on the tempo marker and then left-clicking and dragging it left or right to line up with the beat on the waveform.
You call me again. You call me again.
As you can hear, once these vocals come in on this rendered track, it gets a bit more difficult for me to see where the beat is, so I have to very carefully listen at this stage.
You call me again. You call me again.
One more measure.
Me again. Me again. Drunk in your bed. Me again. Drunk in your bed.
Now let's go back to the beginning of what we've edited and take a listen to this metronome. I'll turn it up just a little bit further. And let's see how closely we've matched.
Call me again, drunk in your bed.
That sounds pretty much spot on to me. As I'm sure you can see, creating a custom tempo map can be pretty tedious, but it definitely has its benefits. Let's fast forward a little bit and take a listen to the finished tempo map. I've got the tempo mapping completed, and if we take a look across the top, you can see that's quite a bit of work. But with a grid that's been properly configured, I can now go back and either slip edit my drums, or even better, re-record my drums, since I'll be able to hear some semblance of a consistent time to keep up with. So even though my drums are not perfect, let's just take a listen with the click engaged and see how this sounds. We'll go back to the beginning here, and give it a shot.
Call me again, drunk in your Benz, driving home under the influence. You scared me to death, but I'm wasting my breath, 'cause you only listen to your fucking friend. I don't relate to you, I don't relate to you, no, 'cause I'd never treat me this shitty. Misunderstood, made all my moments your own. Just fucking leave me alone.
Alright, so even though my drums were not spot on, keep in mind that they were recorded before I did the tempo mapping. We now have a grid that matches the song close enough to where I can either go back and re-record my drums, or slip edit my existing drums, or add any time-based effects or virtual instruments that I'd like. So yes, while this definitely can take a long time to set up, it's very much worth the effort if your intention is to preserve the original performance. I hope this helps. If you like the content you're seeing, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and you can support the channel further by clicking the Buy Me a Coffee. I like coffee. Want some? It's actually tea today. Cup says coffee. Patreon or Super Thanks links below. Visit us on Discord and engage with other Reaper users. Also, check out my drum editing and Reaper course on Pro Mix Academy. We'll see you next time. I don't know that I've ever had profanity on my channel before. There's a lot of that in that song. Good song though.